your enemy. This is one part of 15 half-hour briefings on the history, methods, and pressure patterns of the communist global conquest. These documented presentations are produced by SPX Research Associates. They are unofficial, non-political, impersonal, factual. Alteration by tape recordings out of context is forbidden. Reproduction is also forbidden except with written permission from the distributors, Doris A. Parks and Kent H. Defkin, or their agents. Now the briefing officer, Colonel Tom R. Hutton, United States Air Force Reserve retired, Director of SPX Research Associates. Colonel Hutton.
God save the United States of America. Part 11 brings us to 3 more pressure areas of the communist global conquest for study. 2 of them, finance and economics, are highly vulnerable. That is because in this form of warfare we have been studying, some of the enemy's greatest aid comes from the conservative, who is so conservative that with all good intentions he actually serves as an instrument and vehicle of paralysis. A great many individuals and a great many groups in the areas of finance and economics fall within what may be charitably called the Hades Paving Corporation's Unlimited. I suppose that all human history holds no greater anomaly than may be found in the attitude of the well-heeled American financier or businessman toward the communist global conquest which is aimed at him and what he stands for. Enemy estimates, based on realistic staff studies over the years, are firm in the conclusion that the communist global conquest has nothing to fear from the National Chamber of Commerce, Wall Street, or the National Association of Manufacturers. Even those great global corporations to whose properties he has helped himself so freely without payment, apology, or reimbursement of stockholders support the enemy's estimates with singular obtusity. The record of 17 years and the devastated economies of his captive nations are with him. If he now evaluates American financiers and businessmen as delectable rabbits and babbits who serve his purposes now and will serve them in future, it may well be because he is a realist. He rightly finds, for instance, not the slightest threat to his conquest in the businessman, financier, executive, or even the legislator who, from plush-lined after-dinner podium, proclaims to a comfortably well-fed audience that he is against communism, and lets it go at that. Out of experience, enemy knows that yon white-tied, twin-tailed trumpeter of stultaloquence has only the foggiest notion of what he is talking about, and may even agree with the Supreme Court that the communist global conquest is a political rather than a military operation. Enemy knows that even the financier or businessman who is vaguely alarmed about Moscow's march across the world's economic ruins does not, because he will not, associate that sweep with any personal threat to what he fatuously believes to be his assured future. Why not? On the record, why not? Indeed, why not? Ever since NEP days, after the Bolshevik takeover of 1917, enemy has found multitudes of financiers and businessmen of the target nations eager to sell him the rope of which Lenin spoke, the rope for their own hanging. And enemy has observed, from countless reports by his NKVD deportation teams, that the well-manicured nails of tycoons, executives, and stockholders make no deeper scratches on the walls of the boxcars in which they are shipped to his slave labor camps than do the frantic unclipped claws of hoi polloi at the other end of the same filthy car. Once the gold has been shaken from their trousers and their bank vaults, once their women folk have been raped and their summer places set aside for Communist Party big shots, there is not much difference, enemy has found, between them and the least of those for whom their opportunities and amassed fortunes now make them morally responsible. As slave laborers, his reports show, they are usually less effective, whine more, die off sooner, and while more gold may be knocked from their teeth at the end, their cadavers are otherwise of little value. To him, their greatest value lies in the target period, when they do so much in so many ways with whatever intent to paralyze resistance by free people. You have watched their boardroom performances, and so have I. At least some of you have seen their pocketbook vetoes reflected in the polished tops of directors' tables, heard them raising their voices against any course of action against the enemy, which might be construed as controversial. That word controversial, through various patterns and techniques in the pressure areas you have been studying, has been converted into a fearsome lash from which they shrink and slink. Yet their very opportunities in life, their successes and their fortunes, have sprung from the most controversial thing in all man's experience, human liberty. And not only their futures, but the tomorrows of their country, their nation, and mankind depend on what they do to maintain that ever-controversial human achievement which now is threatened with extinction. As we proceed, you may envy them such rendezvous with destiny, or pity them in their failure to recognize it, but do not be angry with them, because they are also victims of Dusac and just don't know. Like other multipurpose operations of other areas in the war, we have been losing because the five-star frauds in high places didn't know war when they saw it. There is nothing new about the pattern here. Even in the elaborate pressure patterns of Area 6, finance, enemy's idea is basically the same as Joe Stalin's when he and the butcher robbed the Tiflis National Bank before the revolution. Behind present-day pressures designed to destroy integrity of the American financial and business structure is exactly the same long-range purpose that set the Soviet government's engraving and printing presses to grinding out counterfeit $100 American bills in 1933. That was the year Roosevelt recognized them as a government, and they made promises they have never kept. Less than 3 years later, Moscow stole more than $700 million in 7,000 boxes from the Spanish government, shipped it by steamer to Moscow, and kept it, minus a few hundred boxes that made their way into Kremlin leaders' Swiss and American bank accounts. Some finesse had been added to the operation by the time Lachlan Curry, operating from the White House, and Harry Dexter White from the Treasury Department sent Dr. Xi Jiaoding to China in 1940, ostensibly to act as financial advisor to Jiang, but actually to wreck, as he did, the Chinese currency system. There is a documented sequence that began with the Red Army goon squads which ripped $1 billion plus out of the safety deposit boxes and bank vaults of Berlin because we let them, and the flight of American gold, about which you have heard so much. Too long to tell here, but we shall get to it in an upcoming element. Meantime, you may get a glimpse of it in the references of the documented script on this briefing. Certainly there's nothing new about this one either. As early as 1957, the embarrassing facts of it were being spelled out by Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, which reached two conclusions. One was that enemy was infiltrating American industrial controls. The other was that American money flows behind the Iron Curtain through many channels, all benefiting the communist global conquest. Both are still true and increasingly dangerous. Inside as well as outside the American government, there are those still not willing to face or let others know the facts of life on enemy pressure patterns and operations. One fact is this: lack of concept concerning the communist global conquest has nudged the United States into a dubious foreign aid policy, total annual commitments of which about equal the deficit in the American gold reserve. Brought to a new low of futility in the Eisenhower administration, it is not only to be continued, but expanded in the new one, well illustrated by the pediculous, if not meticulous, American idiom, all loused up. It involves a diversion of American taxpayer money, not only to bolster slippery so-called neutralist governments like those of Nehru, Sukarno, Tito, and Nkrumah, but also to prop up communist slave state governments like that of Poland, which should never be confused with the Polish people. In the first 3 months of 1961, a bill was introduced in the Senate under nonpartisan sponsorship, so to amend the Battle Act that the President, at his discretion, might furnish economic aid and financial assistance to any of the governments of the Soviet slave states, except Red China. Let me repeat what we have previously noted. Despite a very thick coating of hogwash, it means aid to the communist governments, not assistance to the enslaved people of the colonial empire. Hard fact is that it merely rivets their bonds the tighter. Curious thing, isn't it, that an insistent demand by our government for free elections in the slave states, which would help them, is as carefully evaded by the State Department now as it was when John Foster Dulles turned thumbs down on the Hungarian freedom fighters' petition 167 in 1959. Evidence on that is massive. We might spend the rest of the briefing on it, but we have mileage to make and questions to ask. Before we leave Area 6, let's ask one big, embarrassing question. Why do the great corporate tax-exempt foundations of the United States, like the Ford, Carnegie, and Rockefeller foundations, permit use of their untold resources for enemy objectives? That question is prompted by the documented record, if you have even looked at some of the collateral reading you were supposed to do for this briefing. You are at least aware of some of the startling whodunits, like House Report 2681 of the 83rd Congress by the Special Committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations. Now, one of the areas of investigation and conclusion by that committee in its more than 2,000 pages of hearing, testimony, and exhibits from 1952 to 1955 was the Ford Foundation, with special reference to the Ford Fund for the Republic. Perhaps you had forgotten that. Some persons would like to. I've no time here to give you the details of how the Ford Fund for the Republic picked Ed Murrow of the Columbia Broadcasting System, recently made head of the United States Information Agency, to dust the security risk label off of Dr. Robert Oppenheimer after the Atomic Energy Commission announced it had found the scientific intimate of two noted communists to be a security risk and had denied him security data. Perhaps you had forgotten that. Perhaps you have forgotten Mr. Murrow's campaign and how he conducted it. Some people didn't forget. Look where he is today, ready to pick up where George Allen left off. At Rias in West Berlin, they are holding their breath. They know about Mr. Murrow. Moscow doesn't like Rias. Rias, according to word from Moscow, is about to be made what Mr. Murrow calls palatable to Moscow. The fact that he is where he is will never be palatable to those who know. I'm sure you know about Paul G. Hoffman of the Ford Fund for the Republic, who wielded so much influence in the Eisenhower administration, and Dr. Frederick Hutchins, formerly of Chicago University, who galloped to the aid of one Mary Knowles, the Plymouth, Massachusetts librarian, with an award of $5,000 after she refused to take the loyalty oath, but did take the Fifth Amendment in 1953. Perhaps you have forgotten or never knew about the Garland Fund and the payment of $20,000 to Joseph Rao of ADA in the case of the late Soviet spy, William Walter Remington. But you are likely to remember the efforts of the Ford Fund for the Republic to defeat the Munt-Nixon Internal Security Act, as officially documented by House Report 3248 of the 81st Congress second session. Then there were the books selected by the Ford Fund for the Republic to be distributed gratis to college presidents and federal judges all over the country, plus the records of some of the authors as measured by the Stalin Standard. And certainly you must have listened to some of the slanted radio and television programs brought to the American people by the Ford Fund for the Republic, which have done so much to give aid and comfort to the enemy. In this brief examination of some of the pressure operations of Area 6, you find the same interlocking, integrated, and coordinated characteristics that mark each of the pressure areas of paralysis. All have this in common: collateral use of Area 4 information media, as in the Ford-sponsored TV attack on J. Edgar Hoover by Cyrus Eaton, personal friend of Nikita Khrushchev. That was on Columbia Broadcasting System again. With a very bare mention of Eaton's part in that operation, as in Khrushchev's grand tour of 1959, the fiasco at Paris in May of 1960, and the restricted visit of September and October of that year to the United Nations, we find ourselves in one of the most important of the pressure patterns in Area 8, economics. It is Operation Bellwether. Cyrus Eaton is its most woolly, but certainly not its sole example. Not everybody in it gets white stallions and a troika from Moscow as a personal present from Nikita Khrushchev, but many had hopes, and some of the leaders in the American world of economics have been left looking pretty sick, sad, and silly since the Goon Man appeared in his true role at the UN in September and October of 1960 and told all, one shoe off and one shoe on. Soviet Operation Bait is a big one. It is based on Lenin's philosophical observation about rope, and it is predicated on a series of remarkably astute enemy studies on the character and weaknesses of the American businessman. As far as Moscow is concerned, the American businessman is a stupid duck whose patents may be stolen without protest and who can be quacked up to his own destruction by the lure of profit. Khrushchev himself was not quite sure about that until his tour of the United States in 1959, when he was entertained by otherwise respectable American industrialists who had been dragooned by the State Department into giving him red carpet treatment. In many of the plants he found little to interest him. Moscow had stolen the patents on labor-saving machines long years before, and he had seen them in the Soviet version. One of Khrushchev's first reactions to his American trip on his return to Moscow was an order for global circulation of the American industrial house organs that had gone overboard on his tours of their plants. Another was an exclusive grant by the Kremlin to a single British firm to screen, approve, and handle, at a percentage of course, all American advertising in the Soviet Union and some of the Red Slave States. Interesting documentation over the signature of the British firm's officials is available to any proper committee of Congress, the National Association of Manufacturers, or the National Chamber of Commerce. It shows that not one line of American advertising can get into Soviet media without clearance by that British company, which is in turn getting its authority from an NKVD agency. We do not expect this offer will be taken up. May I add that we quite understand why. Enemy is well satisfied with a state of paralysis in American areas 6 and 8. But being a realist, he knows how potentially dangerous they might be to him. Not that they are, but that they might be, even now. For their advertising dollars sustain the entire fabric of American information media from which enemy gets so much help. Their political dollars have much to do with the election or defeat of people enemy wants in American Area 7, or strictly barred from it. So they could hurt the communist global conquest overnight. But the record to date leaves the percentages heavily with Moscow. By contrast, enemy with cause is not so happy about pressure area 9, labor. The Marxian Lenin-Stalinist formula of the general strike that paralyzes bourgeois industry, commerce, and government is not infallible. To an extent, it did help enemy in Cuba in 1958, in Belgium 1960, in some Latin American countries. Not completely. Communist-controlled or infiltrated labor organizations actually constitute forces in being and position in this new type of war. In a general strike, they may be reinforced by labor groups not communist-controlled. But out of the experience of what was once organized labor in the slave states have come growing and hardening convictions and conclusions in most organized labor groups of the remnant free nations. C-47 and Globemaster cargoes of flour, coal, and potatoes at Tempelhof, labor helped win the Battle of Berlin. The record shows that the victory was traded in for another worthless agreement with the enemy by so-called diplomatists who couldn't have gotten 100 weight of Kartoffeln to their shoulders had their lives depended on it. But labor had done its part, and then some. If I seem to have a slight prejudice in favor of labor, may I note that the record has the same bias, only heavier? Part of that record was written in brave blood in the East German uprisings of 1953. The governments of Britain and the United States stood by. Marching Polish labor wrote another part of it at Poznan in the spring of 1956. Again, our side stood by, and freedom lost another chance. Imperishably, the workers of Zeppel Island and the Danube carved it on the fangs of Moscow in the autumn of that year. Shoulder to shoulder with students who had known nothing but communism in their short lives, labor stood to the barricades of Budapest and went down fighting because, again, the forces of freedom were paralyzed through the United Nations, the British Foreign Office, and I am sorry to say, the American State Department. I'm not picking on the State Department. That's the documented record making all the unpleasant noise. Organized labor knows that free labor cannot compete with slave labor. The hired men at Washington should take note that a large segment of organized labor in the United States has begun to look askance at those senators and representatives who owe their seats to labor's support, but now seem too eager to expose the American Union man to the consequences of trade agreements with slave labor governments. They are beginning to ask questions. Ask some of your own. Labor is justifiably doubtful about public servants who seek to bolster the economics of slave labor, where labor has no voice in the government. But the leaders of Area 6 and 8 do not seem to see so clearly. It is by no coincidence that Khrushchev, both in 1959 and 1960, had his best time with American financial and industrial leaders, and his worst, and to him most hateful, with the American labor leaders at San Francisco, 21 September 1959. Certainly this is no adequate coverage of any one of these three fascinating areas of enemy pressure, but it is all we have time for here. So let us turn to a quick summary in the form of questions. Answers to these questions are vital to American survival. American financiers and businessmen hold in their hands the answer to the communist global conquest. Why then do they continue to support with their advertising dollars information media which serves enemy purposes, as outlined in this briefing, others past, and briefings still to come? Why do the great financial tax-exempt foundations of the United States, like the Ford Fund for the Republic, continue to lend themselves and their huge resources to enemy objectives under whatever guise? Why are American business groups ineffective in doing anything which effectively hurts the enemy? Is it because they are uninformed, lazy-minded, fearful, greedy, inadequate, ostriches, or just plain chicken? Have they been brainwashed to the point where they are terrorized by the word controversial? Have they no concept of what has happened to other nations which have now become the slave states of the Soviet Empire? Why are labor leaders like Harry Bridges and Jack Hall, whose loyalties run to the Soviet enemy, permitted to continue the organization and preparation of potential enemy forces in being for paralysis of American transportation? Why do American senators and representatives who owe their very political existence to organized labor continue to urge trade agreements with and economic aid for slave labor enemy states at the expense of American unions? Why do they not tell organized American labor the truth about labor conditions that develop in nations that do trade with Moscow and Beijing? I wish we had time for more of these casual and inoffensive questions which are not at all rhetorical, but for which I assure you there will be no adequate answers. We do not. Immediately we must turn to the pressure areas of law and medicine, which abound in evidence and symptoms. You will find suggested collateral reading on those areas in the manual for this briefing. Please do something about them for your own sake and that of your children. Thank you. This has been part 11 of 15 briefings on Know Your Enemy, a documented study of the communist global conquest produced at cost by SPX Research Associates for the distributors and you. Your briefing officer has been Colonel Tom R. Hutton, USAFR retired, Director of SPX Research Associates.